It's September 1936. You're a banker in Paris, and you are sweating your nation. France is one of the last countries on earth still clinging to the classical gold standard. Your currency, the French franc, is pegged at 655 milligrams of gold. This peg has been defended for 8 solid years, but it has come at a terrible price. The American dollar has been devalued by 41% since 1933. The British pound has been devalued by 30% since 1931. The Japanese yen has been devalued by 40%. This makes your French-made wine, steel, and textiles 30 to 40% more expensive than everyone else's. Your exports have collapsed. Industrial production has fallen 25% below 1929 levels. Unemployment is surging toward 15%. Factories are closing. Riots are in the streets. The government has fallen 5 times in 2 years. This is the gold bloc, and it is a prison. Your nation is just weeks away from a full-blown revolution or a fascist coup. This is the backdrop for the most important global agreement you've never heard of. It wasn't a peace treaty. It wasn't a trade deal. It was a desperate secret pact between 3 men to stop the world's financial system from eating itself alive. To understand what's happening now, with constant talk of trade wars and currency manipulation, we have to go back to the moment it all began. The old world ended on September 21st, 1931. That was the day the United Kingdom abandoned the gold standard. For decades, the global system was simple. Most currencies were convertible to a fixed amount of gold. The British pound was worth text $486. This system worked until it didn't. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, put unbearable pressure on this system. Britain was hemorrhaging gold in just 1 week. In July 1931, the Bank of England lost text $150 million in gold. That's over text $3 billion in 2025 money. The government led by Ramsay MacDonald faced a choice. They could raise interest rates to 15% or 20% to attract gold back. This would defend the pound, but it would also bankrupt every business and homeowner in the country. It was a choice between the currency and the people. They chose the people. Britain floated the pound. It was no longer backed by gold. The value was left to the markets. It immediately plummeted. It dropped from text $486 to text $340 in a matter of weeks. This was a financial earthquake, and it was the first shot in a global currency war. Here's what that 30% drop meant. Suddenly, British-made cars, textiles, and machinery were 30% cheaper on the global market, and everyone else's goods were 30% more expensive inside Britain. It was a beggar-thy-neighbor policy. It boosted British exports by starving everyone else. Countries that traded with Britain were furious. They saw it as a desperate, selfish move, and they were right. Over 20 other countries, from Scandinavia to South America, immediately followed Britain and devalued their own currencies. The world's financial system was shattering, but one country had the power to stop it or make it infinitely worse: the United States. For 2 years, the U.S. under President Herbert Hoover tried to hold the line. They stayed on the gold standard. This decision crushed the American economy. While other currencies fell, the dollar stayed strong, making American farm goods too expensive to export. Farm prices collapsed by 60%. Then in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office. The U.S. was in a full-blown catastrophe. 1/4 of the workforce, 13 million people, were unemployed. Over 4,000 banks had failed in 1933 alone. FDR's first move was to declare a bank holiday, closing every bank in the country. His second move on April 19, 1933, was to do the unthinkable. He took America off the gold standard. But he didn't just float the dollar, he went further. He signed Executive Order 6102. This made it illegal for any U.S. citizen to own gold bullion, coins, or certificates. You were required by law to sell your gold to the government for text $2,067 per troy ounce. If you refused, you faced a text $10,000 fine. That's text $250,000 today. The government seized the entire nation's gold supply so FDR could change the price he wanted to, devalue the dollar to raise crop prices and get farmers out of debt. His advisors told him to move carefully. He ignored them. For months, FDR would sit in his bed in the morning, consult with his Treasury Secretary, and randomly pick a new price for gold. One day he raised it by 21 cents. When asked why, he said it's a lucky number. This drove the international community insane. They called it financial anarchy. Finally, in January 1934, he signed the Gold Reserve Act. He officially reset the price of gold to Text $35 per troy ounce. This was a 41% devaluation of the dollar, a 41% pay cut for anyone holding dollars, and a 41% discount on American goods. The world's two biggest economies, the UK and the US, had now chosen nationalism over stability. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone folded. A small group of countries refused to blink. They were led by France. They were called the Gold Bloc: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Italy, and Poland. They swore a public oath to defend their currencies. To them, leaving gold was a sign of moral failure. The French remembered the 1920s. When their currency had collapsed in a storm of hyperinflation, they had sworn never again. Defending the franc pegged at 655 milligrams of gold became a matter of national honor. But honor doesn't pay the bills. Imagine you're in a three-man boat race. The American rower suddenly takes a 41% lead. The British rower takes a 30% lead, and you, the French rower, are still at the starting line, bragging about how stable your boat is. This was economic suicide. The French economy, which had resisted the Depression until 1931, now went into a nosedive as prices fell 10% in 1 year. The real weight of debt crushed businesses. Unemployment soared. The country became a tinderbox. Fascist leagues like the Croix de Foy brawled with communist unions in the streets. The government in Paris was paralyzed. They knew they had to devalue, but they were trapped. Why were they trapped? They had two problems. The first was political. The French public hated the idea of devaluation. They saw it as theft, a betrayal of the middle class who had saved their money in francs. No politician wanted to be the one to sign that order. The second problem was external. If France devalued the franc by 30%, what would stop the US and UK from devaluing again? What would stop a 30% devaluation from becoming a 50% then 70% devaluation? It would be a race to the bottom, a spiral of competitive devaluations that would destroy what was left of global trade. It would prove that international cooperation was truly dead. France couldn't devalue alone. They needed a guarantee. They needed permission. This brings us to three men in the US. You have Henry Morgenthau Jr., FDR's Treasury Secretary. In the UK, you have Neville Chamberlain, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in France, you have a new fragile government. In June 1936, Leon Blum, a socialist, was elected prime minister. Blum knew he had to devalue, but his own political party had campaigned on not devaluing. It was a complete political paradox. So he and his finance minister, Georges Bonnet, started talking in secret. They used transatlantic telephone lines, a new and insecure technology. They used simple codes referring to the devaluation as the current baby's operation. The negotiations were tense. Morgenthau in the US was the key. He was an internationalist. He saw that the currency war was hurting everyone, including the US. He believed stabilization was the only way forward. But FDR was skeptical. He liked having a cheap dollar. Chamberlain in the UK was also skeptical. He liked the sterling area, the bloc of countries tied to the pound. He didn't want to give up that advantage. The French proposal was simple. We are going to devalue the franc by about 30%. We will only do this if you, the US and UK, promise not to retaliate, promise you won't devalue your own currencies just to match us. This was a huge ask. It meant the US and UK had to give up their main economic weapon. The talks dragged on for months. At one point, the deal nearly collapsed because Chamberlain refused to agree to a specific stabilization price. Morgenthau had to threaten him. He told Chamberlain that if the UK didn't play ball, the US would use its dollar to billion stabilization fund to crush the pound. Chamberlain backed down. The stage was set. On the night of September 25, 1936, the deal was done. It wasn't a formal treaty. There was no signing ceremony. There were no cameras. It was a simple 600-word press release published simultaneously in Paris, London, and Washington. This was the Tripartite Agreement. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic language. It said France had decided to readjust its currency, and that the US and UK welcomed this move as a step toward global stability. But the real genius was buried in the details. This wasn't just a promise not to fight. It was a promise to cooperate. The three nations agreed to use their exchange equalization funds to manage the markets. Here's how it worked. Each country would set up a $24 $hour hotline. If the French franc started to fall too fast, the US and UK would step in and buy francs with their own gold. This would prop up the price. If the US dollar started to get too strong, France and the UK would sell dollars. This would bring it down. It was the first ever coordinated currency management system. It was a pact to end the currency war. The world held its breath, and then it worked. The next day, France devalued the franc by 29%. And the world didn't end. The US did not retaliate. The UK did not retaliate. There was no panic. There was relief capital that had fled France fearing a chaotic collapse now flooded back in. The Paris stock market soared 20% in 1 week. The immediate crisis was over. Within days, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland all officially joined the Pact. The gold bloc was officially over. It seemed like the world had finally learned its lesson. They had seen the abyss of economic nationalism, and they had chosen cooperation. It was called the last good news of the 1930s, and for a short time it was. So if this pact was so successful, why do we call it the Pact? Nobody remembers, which brings us to the fatal flaw. The Tripartite Agreement was a financial truce. It was not a military alliance. It could stop a currency war. It could not stop an arms race. While Morgenthau, Chamberlain, and Blum were negotiating, other things were happening. In March 1936, just 6 months earlier, Adolf Hitler had marched 20,000 troops into the Rhineland, a direct violation of two treaties. France had done nothing. The political situation in Europe was deteriorating. The agreement was a brilliant technical solution to a problem that was already being overshadowed, and the pact itself was fragile. It was a gentleman's agreement between three men. It wasn't a formal institution. It couldn't fix France's deep-seated internal problems. Leon Blum's government failed to stop capital flight. The 1936 devaluation wasn't enough. France had to devalue the franc again in 1937, and again in 1938. The pact held. The US and UK didn't retaliate, but the spirit of cooperation was fading. In 1937, the US itself fell back into a deep recession, killing any global recovery. Then on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Tripartite Agreement was instantly irrelevant. The world's equalization funds were converted into war chests. The great experiment in cooperation was over. It was completely buried by the rubble of the Second World War. But the idea didn't die. Which brings us back to Henry Morgenthau and his chief economist, a man named Harry Dexter White. The two men leading the conference were Harry Dexter White and the British economist John Maynard Keynes. They created the World Bank, and they created the Bretton Woods system. All global currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar was pegged to gold at dollar. Text $35 dollar an ounce. Where did that dollar text $35 dollar number come from? FDR's 1930 for Gold Reserve Act. And what was the blueprint for the entire IMF? The Tripartite Agreement of 1936, the Forgotten Pact, was the beta test. It was the foundation for the 30 years of economic prosperity that followed the war. That Bretton Woods system held for 27 years, until 1971. Today, we live in a world that looks a lot more like 1935. All our major currencies, the dollar, the euro, the yen, the yuan, float against each other. And we hear the exact same arguments. We hear constant accusations of currency manipulation, of countries keeping their currency artificially low to boost exports. It's the same beggar thy neighbor game, the same fight between nationalism and cooperation. In 1936, the world was so broken they had to cooperate. It was a choice between a small fragile truce or total collapse. Which brings us to the question for today: do you think we need a new tripartite agreement? A digital Bretton Woods to stabilize modern currencies, perhaps between the US, China, and Europe? Or is the age of cooperation over, leaving every nation for itself? Drop your prediction in the comments below and subscribe, because we'll be revisiting this topic the next time a financial crisis hits.